Good morning, Tim. How you doing? Thanks for coming on the show.
Man, I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
It's great to have you. Funny
Thank you.
story. Um, I heard that you were coming to speak at our church, and my first thought was, why is the director of Nightmare Before Christmas coming to speak at our church? And because I thought it was Tim Burton, and also thought Tim Barton.
Everybody needs to know about James and the Giant Peach, right? I'm on a mission.
I watched you speak, and man, that was a phenomenal lecture on the historical story of the America's story. Obviously, that's what your book is, and then also just the Christian roots of that, and just the things that are not taught in school nowadays.
Yeah,
we know for obvious reasons why they don't want to do that, but it's like I knew that we had a Christian foundation, but after reading your book, I was like, wow, it was way more significant than I even thought to begin with. So, and the book I'm talking about, folks, is this one right here, The American Story. I highly recommend this book. It is, you really just made it come to life. So, yeah, we're gonna get into that in a little bit. But before we start, I had some icebreaker questions that I want to ask you. So we'll go through some of those, and
I'm ready.
We'll get rolling. All right. So the first one is, can you talk about like a cool God story that happened to you? Maybe you or someone close to you where you were like, wow, that was absolutely God at work there.
Yeah, there's a lot that I could go through. My grandfather was a pastor of our home church growing up. I actually worked on staff with him for a lot of years. And even the story of what God did in his life to start the church, he was born with a cancer. And we're talking about, this is back in like the 1930s, 1940s.
Oh, wow.
And,
yeah.
he had his lungs were failing. They weren't working and nobody knew what to do. Doctors didn't know what to do. And there was this preacher coming through town, and his parents had heard this preacher was praying for people. And they said, hey, we've tried everything else. And so they go to service and they hear the preacher using verses that they hadn't heard their preacher talk a lot about. And it was about God doing these supernatural things, that a God of miracles and God would heal. And so at the end, this preacher prayed and my grandfather was healed and his lungs worked. And it's just incredible things. Well, it really inspired him that he should know what the Bible says. Because again, he heard a couple verses that night, and I don't even remember what verses those are at this point. My grandfather's already passed away. He's with Jesus right now. But, I'm imagining, right? Maybe like by his stripes we are healed. I don't know what it was, but it led him to say, I want to study and know the Bible. And so he began to read and study and know the Bible. And not only did he believe in God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit, but he believed that the same God that did miracles in the Old and New Testament is the same God that still exists today. And so we've seen God move in so many ways because in faith, asking and praying for God to intervene in situations, we've just seen that. And so even in my own life, there's a story my mom loves to tell. It's a little foggy on some of the details for me, but I remember some parts very well. We grew up in the country, and our family, we always had a farm and a ranch. And so we're always outside doing things. And one day I think I was maybe 5 or 6, maybe 7, somewhere in that range. I was just out and I had on shorts and tennis shoes. And I stepped right in the middle of a coiled rattlesnake. And this snake struck me on the leg twice. And my dad saw it. He picks me up and he gets a gun and kills the snake. And he's telling my mom, look on his leg. We got to take him to the hospital. My mom's looking. She says, there's nothing on his leg. And my dad said, I saw the snake strike him twice. And as a kid, right, I don't know anything. I have no context, no perspective, but we had just been learning from Ephesians chapter 6 about the armor of God. And you put on the belt of truth and the breastplate of righteousness, and you shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. And right, all these details from the armor of God. And my parents are like, we don't know what's happening, and there's not a mark. And I was like, guys, it's cool. I put on my armor this morning. And they're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, I put on the armor of God. I'm totally fine. And, I don't know all the details about how God works and what he does and all the details, but certainly in our life, we've seen so many moments where things maybe didn't happen the way they could have happened, or they happened in ways that didn't even make sense. And so in our life, we've seen God move in so many ways, from me being protected from rattlesnakes to people being healed, God opening doors and making connections and provision. And so, I mean, we really could spend hours talking about how God has moved and, our stories, but certainly for me, God is very real. His moving and working in my life, very evident, even as a young kid, recognizing, hey, I got the armor of God. I'm going to be fine.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's really cool. I also like that you remember those stories, because I think it's so important to remember those situations where God moved. It's because sometimes if you don't remember it or journal about it or write about it, it's so easy to forget it or even just dismiss it or rationalize it away. So I think it's important to keep in mind that those were the times where God was acting.
Yeah.
So next one, we'll shift to gears here. Besides the armor of God, what does your everyday carry consist of?
I mean, the two things go together, right? I trust God, and then I do a lot of training. So I blend those two together a little. I feel like I almost have to justify this on some level, because I have a lot of friends and they're haters on this, but I carry a Glock 43X. I use the shield arm mags, TLR7 sub light, and then the Holosun, the EDC, and I love the setup. But growing up, because we lived in the country, I had a Ruger Blackhawk 357 I was shooting 38s out of, and I got it when I was 16 years old. I grew up watching John Wayne, right? Watching Roy Rogers. The revolver is where it was at, right? I wanted the Western gun. I got the holster. It was awesome. And so I grew up with that. So the first semi-automatic I got was a Glock 17. I got it, 2003, 2004, somewhere in that range. And this is also back in the day when 9mm was a lot cheaper to get. And because we live in the country, I was buying the Winchester 100 round. Every week I was buying a couple of them, and I was shooting every week. And because we lived out in the country.
Good old days.
It was wonderful. But out in the country, we have hundreds of acres. And so it's easy for me to shoot on my own property. Also, because we live on the farm, we had all kinds of gear to do cutting and welding. And so we had some steel plates. And so I'm cutting out my own targets. And so I make this incredible range, and I'm walking and shooting. It's so super fun. So I'm shooting thousands and thousands and thousands of rounds every month. And so I got used to locking wrist forward on that Glock. And so when initially there was just a Glock 43 and it's a single stack mag, and then the SIG 365 comes out and you have a double stack, right? And you're like, okay, this makes so much sense, because now I've got so much more carry capacity on it. But I try to do lots of training throughout the year. It's a super fun hobby, but I think it's also very practical and beneficial for lots of reasons. But I was going through a sim house with this 365, and I was doing just kind of on some of the targets because I was trying to go quick. And so I was just doing instinctual, like point out, press out, and squeeze. And that 365, when I locked my wrist forward, that barrel drops down. So all my shots were so low, and I was like, I don't understand. And, obviously I should have been checking my front sights and doing a little better. But I realized I've just put so many tens of thousands of rounds through the Glock platform that it just makes way more sense for me to have a Glock that I carry, since that's what my repetition has been with so much. So I really do. I love the 43X, especially with the shield arm mag. So you can have a greater carry capacity. And I'm a fan of the Glock. And again, all my friends, they love to hate on me for having the Glock, but I love it.
Oh, I love the Glock. It's funny. I have basically the exact same carry setup, except I have the 48 MOS. So I have the TLR mini, TLR7 sub, the EPS with the Holosun EPS, and also found a company years ago that makes the extended beaver tail for the Glock 43 and 48, because I just shot a 17 yesterday with no beaver tail, and it gets my thumb every single time. And so when I got that upgrade, unfortunately the company's not in business anymore because they just 3D printed them. But that thing, I shot it yesterday. Let's see, I was basically just trying to see like, what can I push this thing out to, right? And I shot a steel IPSC target at 200 yards, probably like 3 or 4 out of 10. I mean, obviously it's I'm not it's not 100% accurate, but I mean, even like 100 yards, I can get like 90% accuracy. Now, I'm so used to, I'm relatively new to red dots because my entire life when I've been shooting iron sights, I always shoot with target focus. And I've talked about this in other videos and podcasts. Like when I went to the military and even law enforcement, they'd tell me like, look at the front sight post. I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm looking at the target. Now I'm looking through the sights. I'm using it. I like to tell people I'm using it like a red dot, right? It's got that kind of ghost image with both eyes open. I wrote a whole article on this, but yeah. So but I recently got the red dot, and just having that, really finite, turn the brightness all the way down, and just that small little dot. Oh my gosh, it feels like cheating.
It is a cheat code, right?
Yeah.
But
I have another device that you may be interested in. Yeah, exactly. So my buddy, he created this, like the gas pedals for comp guns.
Oh yeah.
So my buddy created a folding gas pedal, and it fits in a concealment holster. And on any gun, I mean, it works on any gun, but particularly on small frame guns, it just gives you so much, especially with your support thumb forward. It gives you so much more control. Yeah, I'll share that with you later, but it's a pretty cool device. And that thing is, like I said, it folds up into the concealment holster. And also if you have like a level 1 holster, it will make like the tactile click when it locks in place. It actually improves that, because usually they just like lock onto the light or something, but this adds like another point of contact, and you can retrofit and modify any like Kydex style holster to fit this device. So, but yeah, that's it. I'll share that later.
Yeah, offline. Let's get into that a little bit.
Yeah. So next question, if you could master one skill or ability, language, etc., overnight, what would it be?
This device functions like a gas pedal on a competition gun when extended. But unlike those fixed gas pedals, the grip control is specifically designed for CCW and duty use because it folds up in the holster. It works great on all handgun sizes, but it's extremely helpful on smaller frame guns like the Glock 48. The grip control replaces the takedown lever and can be installed in just a few minutes without the need for an armorer. I got this device on my everyday carry gun and have been training, competing, and carrying it every day since then. If you want to get your grip control, then scan this QR code or click the link in the description. And your purchase will help support this channel at no extra cost to you. So thank you so much, and let's get back to the video.
So default, right? I think either language or musical instrument are the two things that I feel like I wish I was better at. I took a couple years of high school Spanish. I have some relatives that are in Germany and speak German. And so by default, I feel like, man, I wish I was fluent in Spanish. I can get by-ish. It's really rough. But having a language would be awesome. But then growing up, I took piano for 8 years and then left it, played guitar for a lot of years. And I think the ability to sit down and just like concert pianist would be amazing. Yeah. So probably music or language would be the default. And if that was where I was going, I would say piano, maybe violin, because again, incredible instruments. And for people that are really talented with them, it's beautiful when they can play it. Or a language would be super practical to give me a little more ability in survival, communication, whatever else.
Yeah. No, I like that answer. That's really cool. I think I would default to that too, like either like a language or some cool skill, like, playing the piano. My daughter, she is where our kids are all homeschooled, and she's one of her like classes is music. And so she uses this app called, I think it's Musician, and it basically listens for the notes. So as she's playing on the screen, it's listening for the notes, and it gamifies it and everything like that. And it's amazing how effective it is. They have it for guitar. They also have one for singing. Like they have virtual voice coaching. It's welcome to the future.
Yeah. They did not have this when we were growing up, right? That was not an option.
Yeah. So yeah, let's, those were phenomenal answers. I love all those. But I really want to get into this, talk about this book, and also talk about you all's company, Wallbuilders, which doesn't, for those listening, doesn't have anything to do with the Southern Wall. It's a completely different wall. But can you talk briefly about, or not briefly, but talk about how Wallbuilders started and kind of the development of that?
Yeah, and to your point, having a name Wallbuilders since President Trump has taken on a totally different meaning for so many people, and it's not that right. We are totally in favor of walls. It's just a different wall that we're referencing.
Yeah.
But it comes from the Bible story, the book of Nehemiah, and Nehemiah was one of the Israelites. When Babylon captured Israel, conquers Israel, they take the captives away. And Nehemiah is an Israelite who actually became the cupbearer for the king. And as his story unfolds, one day he's very sad. The king sees his countenance has fallen, and which seems like a super dangerous position to be in, right? That the king could easily be like, hey, get rid of this loser, kill that guy, bring in somebody else.
Yeah.
But the king liked Nehemiah and said, what's wrong? And he said, I'm so downhearted that my nation's been destroyed and our heritage is gone. I really wish I could rebuild it. And the king tells him, go do all that's in your heart. The king actually funds the expedition. I mean, it's an amazing story.
Yeah.
But Nehemiah is the one that goes back. He calls all of the Israelites who are willing, come live inside the city. He says, everybody, if everybody would just do their part, do what you can, and let's work together to rebuild this thing that's been torn down. And they worked to rebuild Jerusalem. People said, hey, that task is way too big. There's no way you can do it. But in 52 days, when people came together, when they worked together, when people were just rebuilding their own backyard because they're all living in the city.
Yeah.
And what was thought to be this impossible task becomes not only possible, but done in a record time.
Yeah.
And my dad back in the 80s, 1980s, he really felt like this was kind of the challenge and call that God had placed on his life for America. Because even back in the 1980s, you could see the beginning of the moral decline in America. Because if you back up to the 1950s and 60s, if you ask teachers, what are the biggest problems that you're facing in school and in class? The answer from teachers in the 1950s and 60s were the biggest problems they had in school were kids chewing gum and talking in class. Those were the issues, right?
Wow.
Well, if you get to the 1970s and 80s, all of a sudden now you have violent crime that's erupted in public school. You have teen pregnancies. You have STDs. You have drugs. A significant and drastic turn that took place. And my dad began to ask some logical questions of what changed. And interestingly, if you go back and study in the educational cycle and in public schools, where did that change happen? There was a flat line from all these moral behaviors, and flat lines are a little relative. There was a slight increase, but it was less than the population increase, right? So it's below the population increase, but basically, like you have this flat plane, but in 1963, it jumps like hundreds of percent and just skyrockets. In 1962 and 63 is when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that prayer was no longer allowed in public school and the Bible was no longer allowed in public school because they said it violates the separation of church and state and you can't have those things there. Well, over the next couple of decades, and for example, in violent crime, there was a 664% increase in violent crime in public schools. Now, why would that be? Well, maybe because if there is no God, right, and all of a sudden, well, then we determine for ourselves what's right. Because if there's no God, there's no biblical standard, there's no 10 commandments, right? There's no thou shalt not kill. Well, then who determines what's right and wrong? And this is the challenge that has really unfolded in public schools since then, is we've moved away from an objective moral standard of behavior. And now kids don't know what's right and wrong. They don't know what's true. They don't even know what's a boy and a girl anymore because there is no objective standard for truth and morality. All that to say, this laid the groundwork and foundation for my dad to look and say, okay, we recognize that the walls of the spiritual, right, the metaphorical walls of our nation and America have been torn down. And he really felt God was calling him to go rebuild. In Nehemiah 2:17, Nehemiah called all the people. He said, come, let us rebuild the walls that we may no longer be a reproach to the people. And so the name Wallbuilders really was a challenge to every American citizen, every Christian to say, let us come and rebuild the walls. We need to be wall builders and restore the religious, the moral, and the constitutional heritage and foundation of the nation that's come under attack. And so really those are kind of our three thoughts: the religious, the moral, the constitutional heritage of the nation. Ultimately, as an organization, we focus on American history. So we teach American history, but really in an effort to restore the moral and the biblical foundations of the nation. Because if you actually know the history of the nation, it's so different. To your point just a moment ago, it's so different than the modern narrative. And if you go back in time and study it, you realize that the most significant influence in the founding of America was the Bible and was Christianity. So significant, the founding fathers said that America will not remain. America will not work. The Constitution won't work if you remove the Bible, if you remove Christianity. And today there's a lot of people recognizing the brokenness of the nation, and they're looking for all kinds of solutions. And even now, right, we're in the middle of a political cycle and season, and people think that a politician will fix the system. Well, politicians make a difference, and you can elect a different politician, and that will certainly help in our scenario. But a politician can only slow down the decay. That they can't fix everything that's broken. What we need is a restoration of the Bible and a return to the Christian principles that have allowed America to succeed so well for so long.
I like that. That's really powerful. And I completely agree. I think it's so important to understand the biblical roots, because without that, you see this experiment that we have that is America. And if you just be like, well, we're not going to acknowledge the Christian part of that, it skews the story, and it completely ignores such a fundamental tenet of why we are where we are. It would be like looking at an iPhone and someone saying like, well, how was that thing built? And like trying to explain it and say, but you don't need to have a degree in mechanical or electrical engineering. You can do it without those things. It's like, no, you can't.
Well,
like, right. It will not work.
Right. And I mean, how foolish it is to try to explain, right, the reality of America and exclude Christianity. It's like saying, hey, let's tell the history of Iraq and Iran and not mention anything about Islam. I mean, you're not going to really understand, right? Well, let's talk about Turkey. Let's talk about Northern Africa, but not talk about the influence of Islam. Then you're not really going to get the whole story, and you're not going to get the real picture. But this is what we have tried to do in telling the story of America and excluding the influence of Christianity, excluding the role the Bible played. When there's some really great books you can go to, like there's one that was done by Donald Lutz, a professor from the University of Houston. He worked with some professors from LSU. His book was called Origins of American Constitutionalism. Came out in the 1980s. And he is not a conservative guy to speak of. He was just an intellectually honest academic. And he said, I want to know what was the greatest influence on the founding fathers. And so what he determined was if they look from 1760 to maybe 1810, right, the formation of America becoming a nation, separated from Great Britain, the Constitution, then the constitutional format laid out, the U.S. Supreme Court. Like let's track this whole kind of procession, this progress for 50 years. He said, if we search through, let's say, 15,000 representative writings from those 5 decades, if we go through those writings and every time there's quotation marks, if we will take those quotation marks and go back and see who were they quoting, then if we can find maybe the people they're quoting the most, we might see who were the greatest influences that led them to do what they did, that shaped their thinking and their behavior. And so they set off with this endeavor. He actually used more than a decade, used all kinds of grad students for this work and this project, working with other professors, other universities. And they go through thousands and thousands and thousands of writings from the founding fathers. And it's worth noting, right, for the modern generation, some people listening, that they've never known a time without the internet. Well, from us who are a little bit older, right, we can remember before Google existed, right? You couldn't just type in a search engine and look for something. You had to go to the library. And so these are people doing extreme, extensive research.
Wow.
And at the end of years and years and years of research, he says, I think we have a pretty good idea of who the greatest influences were. And what's interesting, he said that the number one cited individual was someone from what would be considered the Enlightenment, Charles Montesquieu. He was a Christian Enlightenment thinker, right? So not like the secular Enlightenment, we don't need God. He was a Christian, but he was in that Enlightenment period. And Charles Montesquieu wrote the Spirit of the Laws, very influential. A lot of founding fathers quoted it. 8.3% of all the quotes they found in all of their letters and writings came from Charles Montesquieu. Second place was William Blackstone. He did Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. And third place was John Locke. He wrote the two treatises of government. and John Locke was 2.9%. So you start with 8.3% with Montesquieu, then 7.9% with Blackstone, then John Locke's 2.9%, and then it drops way down. Well, those were the top cited individuals. However, it was not the top cited source. The number one cited source from the founders' writings was the Bible, with 34% of everything in quotation marks came from the Bible. And where it gets even more interesting to me, he says, we only included what was in quotation marks. He said, however, in reading their letters and their writings, we noticed many more references to scripture, to Bible characters and Bible stories and Bible examples than what were in quotation marks. And had we included those references, the number would have been far higher than 34%.
Wow.
You're talking about, at this point, what, 40+% of the influence that the founders are referencing and quoting in their writing comes from the Bible. So guess what the most influential thing for the founding fathers was? The Bible. Guess where they got their ideas? The Bible. And by the way, to go further, if you actually start reading the founders' writings, they actually tell you where these ideas come from. They'll quote the literal verses that shaped the way they thought about those issues. The problem is today that most of our thinking of America or the founding fathers has come from a modern academic narrative, not from going back and, for example, reading the letters of George Washington or John Adams or Thomas Jefferson. No, we haven't actually read those letters. And if you go back to the letters of George Washington, there's more than 100 books containing just the letters of George Washington. So this dude wrote a lot of letters, and he was pretty clear in a lot of areas what he thought, what shaped his thinking, his influences. And even if you go through, for example, his military career, the American Revolution, he actually encouraged all of his officers to go to church because he said, we need to set the proper example for our soldiers, because what is the most important thing for our soldiers is that they are good Christian soldiers. And he encouraged that all of them be Christian, because he also explained in other letters that we cannot risk doing anything that would offend the Almighty, because we are too reliant on his help in this endeavor. And without his intervention, we will not succeed. Well, that's not a secular guy. That's someone saying, we know we have to have God's help. Without God's help, we're not going to defeat the number one power in the world at that time, the Great Britain military. But again, even though this is very clear in his writings and letters, most people have never read their writings and letters. And so we form our opinions based on the modern narrative. And the modern narratives are not necessarily, and maybe even not usually, historically correct. But most people haven't taken the time to study history well enough to recognize how incorrect the modern narrative actually is.
Well, and I would also guess, especially based off of reading your book and then some of the research I did after it, that it wasn't just a general reference to a God or to God. It was Jesus Christ. And
Yes.
I've noticed that we have, we have in God we trust on our money, but we've tried to sterilize it and make it just this, just God, this thing. And I really would like more people to acknowledge that, no, it's Jesus. It's the Christian God. It's not just a God, generic,
Correct.
Whatever God fits your style, fits your lifestyle. It's the Christian God.
Yeah. And this is, to your point, this is very clear in their writings, right? If you, for example, go to John Hancock, and I can give dozens or hundreds of examples, but this is an easy one. John Hancock, really famous signature in the Declaration, right? He was a president of Congress during the Revolution, but he's the first governor of Massachusetts. John Hancock, as governor of Massachusetts, on 22 occasions called his state to prayer. And he would do two different kinds of proclamations. He would do some for prayer and fasting, and then some for prayer and thanksgiving. And if you go back and read, and you can find these online, there's a reason I'm mentioning it, and the reason I'm using John Hancock as an example. He's a famous name. Don't take my word for this. Look up John Hancock prayer and fasting proclamation, right? Just type it in to Google or whatever search engine you use, right? Mm-hmm. Type it in, and then when it pops up, there will be lots of examples. Click on one and read it. And in every single one of his prayer and fasting proclamations, one of the things that he encourages his state of Massachusetts to pray for, that if there is anybody in their state that doesn't know Jesus Christ as their personal Lord and Savior, that they would come to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ in their own life. They would repent of their sins. They'd be forgiven by the Almighty. But like, this is in his prayer and fasting proclamations. Why does that matter? Because they were very clear about these issues if we would actually go back and read their writings. But most people have never read their writings. Now, to give even deeper connection with America as a nation and not just specific founding fathers, if you look up the Peace Treaty of Paris, it is a document that ended the American Revolution. It brought peace between us and Great Britain and established America as a free and independent nation. If you look that document up, Peace Treaty of Paris, look at the title of the document. And this document, by just kind of connection for us, is still on display in Washington, D.C. at the State Department up on the 6th floor. It's called the John Quincy Adams State Drawing Room. So just by the way, if you want to go see this, it's still available to public viewing. The title of the document says, "In the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity." Well, who's the holy and undivided Trinity? That's the Christian reference to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So this is the document that makes America a free, independent nation. It brought peace between us and Great Britain. It ends the revolution.
Wow.
And it came in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's on official government documents. So this is not a one-off. This is something we find all over. And some people might argue, well, yeah, but it's not in the Constitution, and that's like the official governing document. Okay, I don't disagree with that. But I think some people misunderstand the role of the Constitution, right? Because if you have a company, you might have your articles of incorporation, and then you have your policies of how you will operate as a business. Well, the policies are not always giving the vision and the mission, right? This is how we execute what we're doing. The Constitution is how we execute, right? The articles of incorporation, the vision, the mission statement, that came in the Declaration of Independence. And the founding fathers were very clear, even in the Declaration. Yeah. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and they're endowed by their creator. Well, what are we doing? We're referencing that there is a God who made us and that we're endowed by our creator with certain inalienable rights, that this God who made us, he's given us rights, and that to secure these rights, government exists. The role of government is to protect our God-given rights. And so the Constitution says, well, how is the government going to protect our God-given rights? Here's how the government functions. We're going to have 3 branches. Article 1, we're going to explain the legislative branch. Article 2, we're going to explain the executive branch. Article 3, we're going to explain the judicial branch. This is what the Constitution is. It's the explanation of how our government is going to work, but it's not the philosophy of government. And people confuse this and they say, well, the Constitution doesn't really talk about God. Again, you've really misunderstood what the Constitution is for, but I can actually show you a lot of things in the Constitution. Where did these ideas come from? Why did they believe in a separation of powers? Well, George Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, just as examples, all of them wrote in their writings that they concluded we needed to separate powers because we know the heart of man is wicked and deceitful and it cannot be trusted. Well, what does that mean? Why does that even matter? Well, where did they learn that the heart of man is wicked and deceitful and can't be trusted? It is a literal quote from Jeremiah 17:9. It says, the heart of man is wicked and deceitful above all things, desperately wicked, no man knows it. They're literally quoting the beginning of a Bible verse that tells us you can't trust individuals with absolute power, right? The idea that absolute power corrupts absolutely. We can't trust. We have to separate powers. Well, why do we have 3 branches of government? In Isaiah, it says that God is the judge. He's the lawgiver. He's the king. Well, we've seen some different branches of government. But again, the founding fathers literally reference these verses in their writings. And I can go through many, many examples in the Constitution of not only ideas coming from the Bible, but I can show you the letters of the guys who were there saying that the idea from the Bible, this verse from the Bible is why they did what they did. But when you don't know history, when you haven't read their writings, it's easy to look at the Constitution and think, well, this is a really secular document. But you can only think that if you don't know the Bible, number one, again, because there's a lot of Bible references even in the Constitution. You have to not know the Bible, but then you have to not know history. Because if you would actually read the founders' writings, and if you actually know the Bible, you would recognize These guys are quoting and referencing the Bible all the time. And so many of the ideas, even in the Constitution, come specifically from the Bible. And so, to your point, our nation was not founded on some generic idea that, well, we should have religion, but, we're kind of ambiguous as to what that looks like. No, they were very clear. They were very clear when you can go through the writings again of Washington and Adams and Jefferson, and they all agree there's no greater moral teacher than Jesus. And without a moral foundation, this American experiment cannot last. Where George Washington in his farewell address, right, that the last significant political thing he does on his way out, gives this farewell address. And he says that religion and morality are the indispensable supports of our political prosperity. Right now, political prosperity, that's our thriving as a nation. He says, you're not going to thrive as a nation without religion and morality. He then continues and said, in vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars. Meaning, if people oppose religion and morality, they don't really love America, right? They're not a patriot, because religion and morality are the only thing that allows this experiment to work. The following year, John Adams is president. He writes a letter to the militia of Massachusetts, and he says, among many things, and the whole letter really is worth reading. It's a great letter. But one phrase from the letter, he says, our Constitution was made only for a moral and a religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any others. Now, why does that matter? Because they understood that the American idea, the experiment, was that we, the people, are in charge, that right, freedom exists. The government is only here to protect our God-given rights, but we live as free people. Freedom only works if you have a moral compass and a moral code, right? Because without freedom, America turns into like Chicago every weekend. That's not going to work. So you have to have a moral underpinnings for freedom to work. And the founding fathers were so clear. And again, like universally, founding fathers agreed there's no greater moral teacher than Jesus, and there's no greater moral teachers than those found in the Bible. And so they actually encouraged that the Bible be used as the number one textbook in public schools for kids learning to read. They should learn to read from the Bible. And by the way, when Thomas Jefferson was president, he is one of the members of the school board of Washington, D.C., because Washington, D.C. was a federal territory, so it's under the control of federal government. And the president would always, he was almost like, in essence, considered like the mayor of Washington, D.C. And that was kind of an honorary title, but he was very influential. Well, Jefferson came up with what he considered the education plan for public schools in Washington, D.C., and his idea was that every single student learns to read from the Bible so they can become familiarized with the moral teachings of the Bible, which is what they need to succeed in America. Now, again, that's universal sentiment from the founding fathers. You don't find a single founding father against this idea. And yet today we're told, no, right, generic, because they didn't want to establish a religion, right, separation of church and state. That's not what that phrase means. People have so misunderstood this. They believed in separate institutions. They never advocated for secular institutions, right? Like, major difference. Because if you go back in their era, this is the era when kings all over Europe are choosing denominations, and they're making all of the people in those nations attend those churches. And if you don't, like, go back to King Henry VIII, the guy that is a founder of the Anglican Church, right? And there's a lot of details in the midst of that. But the big picture is when he founds the Anglican Church, he says, from now on, England is Anglican. And we only have Anglican churches. And so there was like underground churches, but even like William Penn, who's the founder of Pennsylvania, he was a devout Quaker. He was arrested multiple times for going to Quaker meeting houses. And Quakers, they're pacifists. Like, these are not people trying to overthrow the system.
Wow.
But because they were not attending the Anglican Church, he was arrested and imprisoned. It's the reason the Pilgrims left to come to the New World to find religious freedom. Well, this is not just happening in England. In Germany, the official religion of Germany was the Lutherans, because that's where Martin Luther was from. And they found the Lutheran religion. Well, if you didn't attend a Lutheran church, you could be arrested, imprisoned, or worse things could happen to you. If you were in Spain or France, you were Catholic, and that's what you had to do. The king chose a denomination, and he made everybody else follow. And so they said in America, okay, we're going to separate institutions. We are not going to let like the Pope or right the head of the Anglican Church tell us what to do. We're separating institutions. But they never imagined they were going to secularize institutions, because they knew we need a moral foundation. And by the way, this is also a biblical idea, because if you go to the book of Exodus, Moses is the one that God gave all the law to. Well, Aaron was the one over the temple, the tabernacle, right? That's a church. You have two separate leaders, but neither of them were secular because Moses is getting all of the law from God. The idea was never to secularize institutions, but it was to separate. And today people say, nope, separation of church and state, as if that means that we're not supposed to have any kind of religion or moral influence in a government arena. Well, that's absolutely ridiculous and foolish, but that is what's being advocated today because we don't know history and we don't recognize every single founding father who became a governor or a president. They did prayer proclamations, calling on their states or calling on the nation to pray. Now, if the argument people are trying to make is, yeah, but the founding fathers wanted a separation of church and state. If they really believed in separating church and state, then why did they as a government leader call on the state or on the nation to a time of prayer if they believed in separating, right? In the sense of secularizing, you're not supposed to have religion in government. No, it's because we've misunderstood it. They did not believe in secularizing government, but they believed in separating the institutions so that the government is not going to force and coerce you of how you're going to live your faith and what church you're going to go to. But again, the idea was never to secularize America. And this is where, because we don't study history, we have bought into so many false narratives, not even realizing that we're believing something that's not historically accurate.
No, absolutely. That was, man, you said so many awesome things there. I hope you guys were paying attention. We could just end the show there and we'll be good. But no, a couple things you said that, I was just, as you were talking about it, I was just thinking about like the juxtaposition between the leaders then and the leaders now, and how much the leaders then were not ashamed to talk about Jesus, not ashamed to talk about their faith. And even the leaders now, when they do it, it's going back to that sterilization. They sterilize it, and it's just general, so we're just going to pray, or, they're in our thoughts and prayers or whatever, but they don't ever get very specific. It's very rare to find, honestly, I don't even know if I can think of a politician off the top of my head who gets very specific. Yeah. And you can tell that they are specifically talking about Jesus Christ and the Christian faith.
Well, and so Taylor, to your point, I'm encouraged on some levels because we're seeing more examples of this now than we've seen in the last couple of decades. But to your point, there's not very many. But like Governor Stitt in Oklahoma, strong Christian person of faith. Awesome. Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders, Arkansas, right? Strong person of faith. And they will talk about Jesus. And of course, you're going to have people like attorneys from the ACLU who are like, you can't talk about him in public. And they're like, all right, you're ridiculous. Bring it. Yeah. Like, I'm not scared of your lawsuit. But to your point, it's not the norm, and it used to be the norm. Right now, it's the exception. It's very rare. You don't see it very often. And if you go back in the founding era, like that's the norm. That's the way it was, where virtually every governor is doing this. It would be more unusual for a governor not to have times of prayer and fasting or prayer and thanksgiving than it would be for a governor to do it, because that's just what everybody was doing. And it does indicate how far our culture and our nation has shifted and what we've normalized, and maybe even on some level, right, what we've even demonized, saying, whoa, no, politicians shouldn't be doing that. Why? Right? Because we bought into a faulty narrative. And maybe there's even some good-hearted people who would say, yeah, but right, Taylor, Tim, if we allow politicians to have religious beliefs, well, what if there's people who aren't Christians who have those positions, right? Like if we're saying maybe we should even have prayer in public school or the Bible in public school, what happens if there's people that come from a different belief system? Like, well, we don't want that to be taught. So maybe the best thing to do is not talk about it at all. Well, that's actually not a very solid biblical position, right? Where if you go back to, for example, when Peter and John in Acts chapter 4 and 5, they're teaching about Jesus, right? And they're told, hey, you guys shouldn't talk about Jesus so much. And they say, well, should we obey God or obey men? Right? Rhetorical question, because we know who we should obey. We're going to obey God. And even if you back up, it's interesting. Where do we get the idea of the freedom of religion? That's a Christian idea, because the freedom of religion is not a concept taught in Islam. The freedom of religion is not a concept taught in the Buddhist or the Hindu faiths. Okay. The freedom of religion is a Christian idea. Why? Because from the very beginning in the Garden of Eden, God always gave people a choice. God gave Adam and Eve a choice, right? I've made all of these trees, all the trees of the garden are for you, but there's one over here. God gave everybody a choice. Joshua leading the Israelites right into the promised land. He said, you need to choose this day whom you're going to serve. Whether the gods of the Amorites, the Amalekites, like the God of all the lands we passed through, maybe the God of the lands we're living in now, or the God that delivered us from Egypt. He said, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Well, why did Joshua say choose who you want to serve? Because God always gives people a choice. In 1 Kings chapter 18, Elijah's up on Mount Carmel with the prophets of Baal, and they have a contest to see which God's going to answer by fire. Well, why are they even having a contest? God is not insecure, right? And the idea that no, we can't allow Christianity to compete against something else. Why? Like I would love to say, let's sit down and talk about this, because objectively speaking, if we compare religions, there's a few obvious comparisons that are easy to look at. If you look at religions and you want to say, okay, how do we examine what are the best religions out there? Well, maybe some easy thoughts are, well, who are the heroes of those religions, right? And let's say, who's the hero of Christianity? Jesus. Cool. Who's the hero of the Islamic faith? Muhammad.
A womanizer.
Right. Let's compare these two. Yeah. Right. So Muhammad, who's taking child brides, multiple brides, right? Who is supporting war and killing of all the people that you disagree with and don't like and all of your enemies, who is in favor of enslaving people, right? Or you have Jesus, who says, treat other people the way you want to be treated. Love your neighbor as yourself, right? These revolutionary concepts. Well, let's just compare the heroes, right? Let's compare the moral teachings from this. And can we see, is there one that's objectively better or different? And again, this is the reason I have no problem saying that, well, let's open this up and say, we have to understand there has to be some kind of moral standard that we're teaching our kids, because if we say everybody chooses for themselves, that's called subjective morality, and that never works in reality, right? Because, I mean, Taylor, right? For people that actually do some firearm training, people that are competent, that are very capable, if we said, hey, everybody do what you want, well, if we didn't have a moral code and compass, then it becomes the law of the tiger, the law of the shark, right? It's the biggest, the meanest, the best trained. They get to do whatever they want. Well, that's not going to work very well, very long, right? Because what happens if somebody's like, hey, rape is wrong, and somebody's like, well, I think rape is right. Who gets to be right? The bigger, the meaner, the stronger. That's not a good way to do this. Yep. There needs to be some kind of moral objective standard. Well, if we need morals to live by, then really the only question is, well, where do we find the best objective moral standard? And there's never been a better moral teacher than Jesus. There's never been higher moral standards than those found in the Bible, found in the New Testament. So this really is not as complicated as we are making it. So for those who are like, no, we don't need religion in schools, well then what standards should we use to teach kids right and wrong? Like, it's not as complicated as we are making it, but we're pretending like this is the biggest moral dilemma there's ever been. I don't think we've critically thought through this well enough when we're coming up with that conclusion.
I completely agree. I think it's very tempting for Christians who maybe tend to be more libertarian to think in terms of like, well, yeah, we need to not have that because everyone just needs to do what they need to do. And it seems to be very tempting in that mindset to, especially like on topics like abortion, to be like, well, I'm going to argue abortion without referencing the Bible. And I used to fall into this camp of thinking, okay, well, if I ever encounter someone who's not a believer and I use the Bible to argue for pro-life, then they're going to discredit that. Well, it's like, okay, well, obviously, right? So you have to start at a lower level of analysis. And that lower level is whether or not, like, where did this come from? All of this come from, right? Let's talk about creation. You can't piggyback on those lower levels of analysis up here if you disagree down here, because you're obviously never going to agree. And so starting at those first principles is important. And it's it takes longer, right? It takes longer than using something like, what is it? The SLED argument, size, location, education, development, which that works on a pig. I had a guy from Abolitionist Rising, which is an abortion abolitionist.
Yes.
And he was talking about even like the pro-life movement, how oftentimes it's just, there's so many faults with the pro-life movement where it's like, guys, like we just need to abolish abortion, criminalize it, abolish it, get rid of it. Don't give the devil any sort of quarter whatsoever. But yeah, what you're saying is it's so obvious is that's what we need. We have to have a moral foundation. And that moral foundation comes from somewhere, because without it, it's Darwinism, which that's where all this started, right? Whenever Darwin said we're from animals, it's like, oh, okay, we're from animals, so there's no more God. And that you could just kind of point it back to that location.
Yeah. Well, Taylor, I would also add, like in the context of this thought, if you go back prior to 1980, do it just a quick, anybody listening, like just a little quick research. How many school shootings were there prior to 1980? And how many of them have been from 1984? Now, 1980, I'm using on purpose. Now, we also could talk about prior to 1980 that there was a time when fully automatic weapons was legal for individual citizens to own, right?
Yep.
In fact, if you come even into the 1980s, like it was very, very normal in the 1980s that boys in high school would have their shotguns sitting in their truck window, right? Have their deer rifle, have their 22, like loaded guns at school with them, windows rolled down. Like anybody can access these guns, and nobody sold the guns. There weren't school shootings, but in 1980, there was a case, Stone v. Graham, and it was Kentucky had passed a law that required the displaying of the Ten Commandments in every school, in public school in Kentucky. And this case was challenged by an atheist, went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, yeah, you're not allowed to display the Ten Commandments in public school anymore. Now, again, why does this matter? Because the Ten Commandments is where we get the idea that we're not supposed to murder other people, right? We're not supposed to go around killing people we don't like. But when you remove the Ten Commandments, which has been the basis for morality for all of the Western world, when you remove the Ten Commandments, now what is the basis of morality? And I don't think it's a coincidence that now we are seeing, right, it's like every month or two, there's another school shooting where somebody, not to derail on this too much, although we could spend some time talking about some significant characteristics, similarities of the last couple of years of mass school shooters with some of the mental illnesses they're dealing with and the propaganda being promoted and taught to them. But what is worth noting is you see that they don't have a core belief value system that teaches them that murder is wrong, that taking innocent life is wrong. Well, when you remove a moral standard, again, like, it's just worth noting, prior to the Ten Commandments being removed, there's like one example of a mass shooting from a school. Wow. After 1980, it's hard to keep up with them now, right? Because we've removed a moral foundation. And, Taylor, talking about just kind of going back to the basic principles, it's so true. It's easy to think about when somebody walks you through it, and like, you can't do algebra until you know 2 + 2 is 4. Like, we have to start with the basics, but you can build pretty quickly because a lot of these things are so logical. But most people have become so used to repeating what they're told. We're not really good with logic. We're not really good with critical thinking and reasoning because we're not taught that in culture. Yep. And it's one of the reasons that I am so in favor of public school, returning to some of that classical model of education where we're teaching reason, we're teaching logic, we're teaching critical thinking. Instead of giving kids fish, let's teach them how to fish. And if we were doing that, there's polling right now that indicates that nearly 75% of college students are in favor of socialism. Why? Because they're repeating what they've been told, not because they've ever critically thought through the process. Right? Because socialism has never, not even in one country, it's never increased or improved the economic situation of the country. It's never increased personal prosperity, and it's never increased personal freedom. Well, you talk to any college kid, they want money and they want freedom. Well, then why are you advocating for something that doesn't give you what you want? Because they're used to repeating the mantra they've heard they haven't been taught how to process and critically think with logic and reason and go through it. But if we can help have that conversation, we can walk people from 2+2 to more in-depth and deeper levels, but we have to start with the basics to help them understand the journey of the process. And it's not as complicated, I think, as sometimes as we make it. It's just that we've never done the work. We haven't done the research. We haven't done the processing or the unpacking of that suitcase to help people understand the way this really works.
No, I completely agree. Yes, I think understanding those first principles and logic and philosophy are so important because it's just not taught anymore. And no one knows how to think critically. No one knows how to really, a lot of people like to deconstruct, but then they don't know how to construct. And
right.
It's the, even just talking about like logic and religions and stuff and comparing the religions. I mentioned this before, but when I look at all the religions out there, there's only one where you don't have skin in the game when it comes to salvation. There's only one where God came down. And if you think about it in mathematical terms with a division, if you have anything in the denominator, right, that's it's basically a comparison. And so if you think about God is the denominator, and if you have infinity in the denominator, anything divided by infinity is zero. So our works are the numerator, God's the denominator. Whatever you have a billion works, good works. Well, it's still zero. You have one good works, it's still zero. The only thing that's not zero is infinity, God, and that's undefined mathematically. But not to get too nerdy, but it's like it even just works mathematically. It makes sense.
Right.
If we're going to prove ourselves before a perfect God, we have to have a perfect comparison, and that would be Jesus. It would be putting all of our trust in Jesus. And so even in the Christian faith, with like people being able to evangelize or Christian apologetics, I really wish Christian apologetics would come back, because there's when I've been in church my whole life, I can't like point to a moment when I was saved. Like people that point to a moment, well, I've been in church my whole life, so it's like I don't really know. But I do know that when I was younger, I didn't really understand the gospel. I didn't really understand. I could answer like a multiple choice test about it, but I didn't fundamentally understand it until I got like in my later 20s and started reading about it and understanding like what it actually means. And then it made sense to me. But I think, especially in the South, pastor sometimes says we have more Christians than people. But I think it's true. It's like it's just ubiquitous everywhere, and no one really has to think critically about it. And so I love what you said earlier too about how they used to use the Bible to teach people how to read. And when you inculcate that at an early age, then that just grows into something much greater than just saying like, well, we're just going to sequester this to Sunday, and then the other 6 days of the week, you're just going to learn about whatever the government, or 5 days, you're whatever the government wants you to learn about, which, separation of church and state, even though we don't understand that.
Right. And, as a Christian too, this is such an important point, because the Apostle Paul, when he says that I was put here for the defense of the gospel, the word defense he uses is the word apologia in Greek. It's where we get the word apologetics, right? Mm-hmm. The Apostle Paul, he felt like his calling was to help explain why does this matter? Why does this work? Why should we be doing this? And for most Christians, we don't as a group really know what we believe, and we certainly don't know why we should believe it. And it's one of the reasons that also when we see the numbers of kids that go to college professing Christianity when they go, and they will have denied the faith before they graduate. And it's an astronomical number. Yeah. And it's because they weren't grounded in the faith. They weren't rooted. They didn't actually know, why does this matter? What is the answer for this? And there's a lot of logic behind it. But I think Christians, and even, Sunday school is not as much of a thing anymore as it used to be. It used to be every church would do Sunday school. Now we've shortened services, and we've tried to make it as user seeker friendly as possible, so everybody has a good time. And there's not the depth of the word there used to be. But one of the traps Christians have fallen into is very similar to what happened in education. If you go back to the early 1900s, when progressives take over education, this is also when you have the second industrial revolution. So you have all these factories, right? These kind of assembly line things are happening. Rockefeller starts the very first ever educational foundation, very first one. 1903, he put $1 million in. By 1907, I think it was like $47 million, something that he had put in. And that was millions back then. So that's like $1.5 billion today. He puts in, and he's not just tax sheltering this. Like he really wants to change education. And part of what he does is the guy who actually runs it, he's on record. He says, we don't need schools that produce better philosophers, better poets or musicians. And he goes through this whole list. Like, we don't need all these skilled, talented people in areas. He said, instead, we need better workers for our factories. Mm-hmm. Now, what does that mean? It means they want people that when you're on an assembly line and they're like, hey, screw this nut and bolt together. They're not saying, hey, excuse me, sir, there might be a better way to do this. They're like, no, I don't need your ideas. I just need you to do what you're told. Well, this is part of the change they want to bring about, that people would just do what they're told. So they begin introducing new concepts in education. Part of the new concepts they introduced was part of the new teaching and testing methods. They introduced concepts like multiple choice, true, false, and fill in the blank. Prior to the 1920s, those things never existed.
Wow.
Now, why does that matter? Because what are we really asking in multiple choice, true, false, fill in the blank? We're asking, what did the teacher tell you was the right answer? Mm-hmm. That's what you need to write down, right? This has nothing to do with comprehension or content mastery, right? Like, this doesn't show that you know the story of the American Revolution. It doesn't show that you know the story of the Civil War. All it shows is that you can repeat what the teacher told you, which was what the whole point was. Well, the problem is we've embraced this same model even in Christianity, that we're like, hey, all right, repeat this prayer after me because this is what matters. Okay, I appreciate that we're trying to help lead people to Jesus, but we've embraced a very secular idea, and it's not what the Apostle Paul even talked about, because, like, not to derail people on this one, but I'm going to throw it out there. Give me the example in Scripture of a sinner's prayer. Mm-hmm. There's not one.
It's not. It doesn't exist.
That is a modern day contrivance. And I can actually go through the history because Billy Sunday's the first guy kind of noted with doing this. He was a big evangelist. They had these big crusade revivals. And he wanted to know, how effective is our ministry? How many people are we reaching? And they said, well, what if we have, right, instead of just having people come to the altar and make themselves right with God, what if we had them just repeat a prayer and you lead them in the prayer, and afterwards we can have them like raise their hand and we'll count them, or we'll have them fill out a card and like we can count how many people repeated this prayer after you, and then we'll count and we'll know how many people did this. That was the introduction of the sinner's prayer. And it was really just a way to be able to count to see how effective the ministry was, which, as someone who's a student of the Bible, I remember a time when King David wanted to know how awesome his army was. And he's like, let me number my army real quick because that's why we're victorious. And his military commander was like, sir, it's a bad idea. Like, your victories don't come from the size of your army. It comes from God's on your side. And David's like, I don't want to hear it from you. I want to know how big and tough my army is. Go count them. And he did this against counsel, and he counts them. And at the midst of them being counted, not only does God speak to him, like this visitation comes, and he's like, you and your hubris and your arrogance thought that your victories came not because of God, but because of the power, the size of your army. God's like, destruction's coming on you. Now, this is not an exact parallel, but it always reminds me of this, right? When ministries are going to count how effective their ministry is, not by how many people they've discipled, but by how many people they got to repeat some words after them. Jesus said, go make disciples of all nations. Like, the better metric to measure is discipleship. Discipleship is a really hard metric to measure, right? It is. But that's a much more significant and closer calling that we should be measuring, because that's actually something that God told us to do, not repeat a prayer. And again, this just goes back to, even as Christians, we've bought into this mantra that is a similar mindset of what progressives have done. And it's not encouraging people to think. It's not encouraging them to use their mind. It's not actually teaching them and training them in the process. It's having them regurgitate something that is not even the best biblical reflection of what we should be learning or doing. And this is where, again, this goes back to like this apologetics idea. Paul said, I've been put here for the apologia, the defense of the gospel. as Christians, we got to be working to make sure that we can defend the gospel, where the Apostle Paul said we should always be able to give a reason for the hope that is in us. When someone's like, dude, why are you a Christian? Well, how well can we answer this? Or, hey, as a Christian, why are you against abortion? Like, why do you say that only a man and woman should be married? Like, what's the deal on that? Like, are you hateful of other people? Are you intolerant? How well can we answer the questions? Because we should be able to. We should be able to answer it very well. No, it's actually because I want the best for their life. And I know that what God made was the best. God came that we may have a life and have it more abundantly. That's what Jesus said. It's a thief that comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And like, I want to be able to explain and walk people through this process. And too often as Christians, we don't know what we believe or why we believe it. And this is where I would encourage, like, not just with American history. We focus a lot on American history at Wallbuilders because we recognize if we knew our history better, we would recognize what made this nation great is the biblical, the moral, the Christian foundation. So like, even when Donald Trump had this slogan in 2016, make America great again. Like, I love that slogan. But I understood, like, you can only make America great again if you know what made her great in the first place.
Yeah.
And what made her great in the first place was a biblical foundation, was a people that had a moral code and compass shaped more by the Bible than by anything else. And if we don't return to that foundation, to that moral code and compass, then we will never make America great again. We can choose different politicians, elect different leaders, but it really comes back to the church, to Christians, to Christianity. And this is where we feel like our calling is at Wallbuilders, is that we've been called to rebuild that wall, hence the name Wallbuilders.
Wow. Well, that was awesome, man. I think that's an awesome note to end on. Real quick, where can people find you and find your organization?
I mean, wallbuilders.com, super easy, but we're on virtually every social media platform except TikTok. We're on all the social media platforms. So you can find us out there anywhere, but wallbuilders.com is the best place to go.
Awesome. Well, Tim, thank you so much for coming on the show. This is a phenomenal conversation. Hopefully we can have a round 2 in the future, but I really appreciate this. And guys, thank you so much for watching. And as always, train to a higher standard.